radio for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network and KGRA, the Global Radio Alliance.
I need your help to get to the year 1985.
You're listening to Fade to Black with Jimmy Church on the Game Changer Network.
Well, welcome. Fade to Black. Bespoke Radio. For the masses. Yeah. How you doing? Today's Wednesday, December 18th, 2019. 352 days into the new year, just 13 days left. We are live from a bunker somewhere in the middle of beautiful downtown Burbank, California, and I would like to welcome everybody listening all around the world, all across the United States. Hither and thither, to and fro, back and forth, up and down, east and west, north and south, far and near. This is Fade to Black for KJCR, the Game Changer Network, and KGRA, the Planets. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. What is cracking, everybody? How you doing? Crazy day, huh? Yeah, man. But none of that matters because tonight we have two very special guests. Marc Cushman is here. It's going to kick things off at the bottom of the hour. Later on tonight, we will be joined by Vic Mignongna, Captain Kirk. That's right. They're both here for our Star Trek special event. Tonight, it's Star Trek. Marc Cushman. Marc Cushman is the author of These Are the Voyages, and the companion audio book is produced by Vic Mignongna, which documents the making of the original Star Trek. Tonight, both Marc and Vic, with both of them, we are going to discuss Star Trek, the history of science fiction on television, including the continuing of Star Trek beyond the original series and scientific achievements, which came out as the result of the series, such as, cell phone design, PCs and the internet, CAT scans, MRIs, and sensor eye automatic opening doors. Of course, we accept it all now, but we know what the progenitor was. Marc Cushman is an author, and he lives here in Los Angeles, and he's a screenwriter, and he's a director. His television credits include Star Trek The Next Generation, Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction, and Diagnosis Murder. His feature film credits include Desperately Seeking Paul McCartney, great movie, The Magic of Christmas, and In the Eyes of a Killer. We'll get to Vic in the next segment when he gets here, but right now I would like to welcome, for the first time to Fade to Black, Marc Cushman. Marc, good evening. How are you?
Hey, Jimmy, I'm good. I want some of that Fade to Black coffee I was hearing about.
Man, if you come to our Christmas party next week at the Rainbow, you know where the Rainbow is. Day after Christmas, man, if you head off the hill, come down to Sunset Boulevard. I'll get you all the Fade to Black blend you can drink.
Okay.
Is that a deal?
That may be worth the drive off the mountain, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, listen, Marc, as a first-time guest, you get the first-time guest disclaimer. Now, you won't have it the next time you're on the show, but you get it tonight, which is this. It's just you and I sitting on my couch having a conversation as friends. And where that conversation starts, it starts. Where it ends, but we're going to end as friends. There you go.
All right.
Had to get that out of the way. So it's a tradition that's gone on for years here on the show. So there you go. I actually want to start here with like one of the most basic questions one could ask on an evening like this, but it needs to be visited, which is, why is it for you? We can discuss the world, but why for you? Why does the original series, Star Trek, live on today like it does? It is as strong or stronger today than at any point in history. What's going on?
The themes. And every episode of Star Trek had a theme. Gene Roddenberry was very adamant about that. Even when I pitched to him in Next Generation, I pitched him the story. He liked it. He liked the hook. And he said, but what's the theme? What are you trying to say with this? And he did that with every writer who came in. And I got to tell you, in all the years that I was out there pitching TV shows, I never had another producer ask me what the theme was until I wrote for Star Trek Continues for Vic Mignongna. And he asked. But Gene was always trying to find the theme for every story. And those messages that are in there are the things that make it feel meaningful. It makes it feel like a good meal. And we come back to it for those.
And there's another aspect to it, because you go back and watch it today, which I do. We all do. And the modern political awareness, the culture awareness, the things that were going on. It was a very crazy time in the United States. Sexual things, all of that was addressed in a science fiction wrapping paper, but
it's the only way you could do it back then.
Right.
They wouldn't let you talk about those things on primetime TV. Only the news division could talk about Vietnam, racism, sexism, God, all that stuff. So Gene Roddenberry had done a couple shows already. The Lieutenant was his most recent series, and he wanted to do a show where he could address these issues. And the only way he could do it, he wanted to be a Jonathan Swift of television. And the only way he could do it was to have it take place on other planets. Now, the network would catch on to it, and there would be great battles between him and the network, and they're all in the memos that I put into my books, which is why there's 3 of them for the series, 1 for each season, because each chapter has about 20 pages, and you're actually reading a lot of the memos from Gene Roddenberry and from NBC, fighting over what the script was saying or trying to do. So they were catching on. But he would try to sneak those things in, and we would see those episodes. We saw an episode called Private Little War about Vietnam in 1968 when it was at its peak, and he's debating the whole issue of Vietnam on another planet.
What do you make of, Star Trek Continues? When I first discovered it, and I immediately chased Vic down, right? I couldn't get enough of it. I thought the writing was solid, the music was solid, but it was also the character development that was there, and it was nostalgic for me. But in a way, I didn't even look at any of those aspects of it. I just felt like I was getting Star Trek Continues, right? I was actually getting the original series. And before, I want to come back and visit that for a second, but I have to bring up the Orville. And I'm sure that you've watched it, but do you get the same vibe from the Orville, the same types of approach to it that is so enduring about the original series?
I do. And that's because Steph MacFarlane is a big fan of Star Trek, and so is Vic Mignogna. And what Vic wanted to do was do the 4th season of Star Trek. It was supposed to be a 5-season show. That's why I'd always said 5-year mission. Mm-hmm. They were trying for 5 years so they could have a good syndication package, and they got cut short after the 3rd year. So Vic said, I want to do what happens between that last episode and Star Trek the Motion Picture, and show us what goes on with those characters and how they make that bridge. And he really approached it with the right attitude. He brought me in to be a story editor to kind of ride the scripts, because I'd read all the memos. I knew Gene, I knew Dorothy Fontana, John D.F. Black, Bob Justman, all these people. And I knew what they would say about each script. So I could give him the memos for those, and I wrote an episode for the show as well. And we did stories that were about the characters. And that's the great thing about science fiction, is you can look at the human condition, and you can look at what's happening right now on Earth by looking at it through alien eyes. I mean, Spock, looking through his eyes, we were really able to examine us.
With all of the follow-up series that came out, so many of them, the great divide in Star Trek fans between the original series and everything else that followed is something that I find fascinating. And I never quite got engaged in all of the new stuff, and I don't know why. I can't put my finger on it. It's slicker, it's better, it's produced, it's great. There's character development, but I can't seem to get into it. And then when I bring up the subject, I might as well be talking about religion, right? The tempers flare. The dedication is amazing.
Well, you know what the first series had, and they kind of lost it. Not entirely, but enough to where we noticed. The first series had great conflict, and that's the key to any drama, is you had the conflicts between the characters, not just with the aliens they were meeting or whatever, the Klingons, or later in Next Generation, the Borg, but Kirk was a swaggering captain. You didn't question him. Sometimes he needed to go to McCoy and say, I don't know what I'm doing, what if I'm wrong? But when he was on the bridge, he's in command, and if anybody challenged him, he would chop them down. So you had the conflicts between him and Spock, between him and McCoy. You had the conflict between McCoy and Spock, and that's the spark of great drama. It's just like doing a show like All in the Family. You put Archie Bunker and Meathead in a room, and the dialogue practically writes itself. Well, it did that with the original show. And when we were doing Next Generation, it was difficult because Gene had decided that by that time, now this is 200 years beyond the first Star Trek, that mankind is going to get over their our petty differences. And so all the characters liked each other. All the characters got along all the time. And it was difficult to come up with inner drama and inner conflict with those characters. We tried, and sometimes we succeeded. But the first show was just a wonderful place for a writer because it was all there.
Were there restrictions on subject, whether it was racism, interracial relationships, politics? Were there any restrictions, or was it a pretty free writing writer's room?
Very free. And I can speak for the first show, too, even though I was a kid when it was on, because, as I said, Gene Roddenberry gave me access to all the show files.
Right.
And I went through all the memos, and he had files on every episode. So you could see the conversations. You could see what they were thinking, what they wanted to say, what they were fighting against the network to be able to say. And so NBC had the restrictions. But Gene Roddenberry did not. He wanted to bring that drama to the screen, and he wanted to delve deeply into the characters. Now, in the later shows, you didn't have the restrictions anymore, but unfortunately, when you have crew and they all get along, you know, you're not going to have the fights and the disagreements that you really like to have as a writer.
Now, this has been debated for decades, but certainly you have insight and opinion. Why cancel the show?
Because of those conflicts. A lot of people thought it was the ratings, and that was the folklore for almost 50 years, 45 years or so.
Right.
When I did my books, we actually went to Nielsen, and we licensed all the ratings for every single episode. And we were stunned that they were much, much better than we were ever told. When the first season was on in 1966, 67 on Thursday nights at 8:30 to 9:30, it quite often won its time slot, up against tough competition, up against the CBS Thursday Night Movie, up against Bewitched on ABC, and it was a close race, and quite often Star Trek was the lead show. So it was doing well for the network. Now, if you look at the overall week, you'll see Star Trek in at around number 30, 35, or whatever, but that's out of 90 TV shows, and it's up against tough competition. But it gave the other networks a bloody nose. But NBC wanted to take it off that first year because Gene was doing stories that just pushed it to the limit. And one of them, The Enemy Within, is a one where Kirk was split by a transporter malfunction, and he had the intellect on one side, and the other one was just primal. And he tried to rape his yeoman. And NBC blew a gasket over that. And when they aired it, they kept telling Roddenberry that he had to not let it be a rape. And he says, oh, no, Kirk's just going to get a little forward with her. Well, if you've seen the episode, if your listeners have seen it, he's on top of her. He's got her pinned to the floor, and she has to scratch his face to get him off. Well, when that aired, Star Trek is winning its time slot for the first 30 minutes. And when that attempted rape took place, it dropped to number 3. And NBC sent him a memo the next day saying, we will not rerun this episode. Don't ever do this to us again. It's in the book. You can read it. And so it was these type of battles between him and the network that made NBC kept pushing Star Trek to worse time slots, later at night, not promoting it, trying to get rid of it.
One of the most difficult things, you're going to laugh, one of the most difficult things to do in Hollywood is figure out the networks. You can't do it, man. You can't. It is the biggest mystery. And if you figure it out, Mark, let me know. We can write that book together. But you cannot control or predict what a network is going to do, can you?
Well, back then, he always used to say, we're just trying to sell underarm deodorant. I mean, and toothpaste. That was the main goal of the network, is to put on non-offensive programming that they can run their commercials in and sell these products. It's gotten more edgy now. I mean, you've had shows like Dexter and The Sopranos and so forth. Sopranos was on HBO, and Dexter, and so you got those type of channels. But even on primetime TV, it's getting a little more edgy, and has been for a while. But it's still it's which way the network's wind is blowing, and the new executives come in every couple of years, and the policies change. So yeah, you really they tell you what they want. They send you the memos. They make it very clear. And most producers will play by the rules. Gene was one of the few who did not. As a matter of fact, the second year the original show was on, NBC did cancel it. But they got over 1 million protests that people were marching on Rockefeller Plaza. They were marching on Burbank, NBC in Burbank, and they got over 1 million letters and petitions to put it back on, and they had to put it back on for a third year, but they stuck it in the death slot, 10 p.m. on Friday nights. But he was fighting them every inch of the way because it was important to him to tell these type of stories. And that's what still resonates, because when we watch this show, okay, the special effects have aged, the costumes have aged, they were all state of the art for their time, as you were just talking about with the communicator, all the things they were doing. But the thing that still comes across is the strength of the characters and the themes of those episodes, which is beyond anything we were seeing on TV for another 20, 30 years.
And if you think about what was going on at the same time, the Andy Williams show, right?
Oh, yeah.
Sonny and Cher. Yeah, right. Yeah. All of Andy Griffith, right? That was programming. And Star Trek comes along, and it wasn't like anything else before. And it woke a lot of people up for sure.
Yeah. Well, when they tried to take it off on that second year, NBC actually went to Irwin Allen to see if he would do a science fiction show for them, because he had shows on CBS and ABC, Voyage to Beyond the Sea, Lost in Space, Time Tunnel. And Irwin played by the rules. He gave the networks what they wanted, and they destroyed his shows. All of his shows started off good. Lost in Space was very film noir, serious science fiction, not as technically accurate as Star Trek, because he didn't run the scripts through NASA like Gene Roddenberry did. But Dr. Smith was a very evil character, trying to kill the kids, programming the robot to kill the kids. But it was scaring the kids, and parents were writing in. And so CBS said either get rid of the character or change him. So they started making the show more of a comedy. And everybody wondered why. Why does this always happen with Irwin Allen shows? Voyage to Beyond the Sea became Monster of the Week. They couldn't do espionage stories anymore like they did in the first year. Well, it was because the networks didn't want those type of shows. Well, then Gene Roddenberry comes along, and boom, he's locking button heads and locking horns with NBC on almost every single episode they made. That's what ended up getting Star Trek taken off the air.
Now, all great artists steal, right? And with Gene, the vision of the future when it comes to everything from the communicators and the weapons to teleportation and all of these things, warp drives, right? All of these ideas came from somewhere. I want to go in a bit on to where these things went to, but where did Gene have a crystal ball, or did he have somebody else suggest these ideas to him, or was he just a prophet?
Gene really was a visionary person.
Right.
And he read a lot of science fiction. He read a lot of fiction. He had a great imagination. And sitting in a room with him, pitching to him, and I felt this, and every other writer who ever pitched to him said he was the best producer ever to pitch to. Because you would put that idea out there, and like you said, we're sitting on a couch talking. That's what it was like being in his office. And he would just pick it up. And you'd start bouncing back and forth, and it would start to develop itself. And his ideas were terrific. He was very open-minded. He very well read. He knew all this stuff, but he hung with scientists. He hung with people from Rand Corporation, from NASA, from JPL, the whole thing. He had Isaac Asimov was a good friend of his, Theodore Sturgeon, Robert Heinlein, and they were always talking in these type of concepts. So that's why you saw this stuff coming out of that show. And the reason we got this technology that you mentioned in the opening was from his relationship with all these people at JPL and NASA. And they would float these ideas by him, and he would say, yeah, let's use that. Let's put them in.
Well, we know so much about the way that Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, brought in the NASA consultants, and everything was rinsed through that and filtered and approved. Kubrick wanted that standard. And you just mentioned that Roddenberry was doing the same thing with NASA. Was it because he wanted to make sure that it would not only hold up for the audience, but under scientific scrutiny too?
Yes. His exact line to them, and it's in quite a few of his memos that we correspond with the people at NASA, was he'd send all the scripts over, all the treatments over, and he would say, I don't need it to be plausible, but I need everything in the show to be possible. I want you guys to be able to watch the show and not laugh at it. So everything you saw in Star Trek was possible. They said, we can't do this now, but we think in 200 years, 300 years, this will be possible. And so there was science backing everything up.
What I find interesting today is when I speak to a physicist or I hear a physicist say, or a scientist, where they're working on these developments, and they go, well, I watched Star Trek when I was a kid. Right. And I wanted to build a warp drive. I wanted to build a transporter. I wanted to build, and how rewarding that must have been for Roddenberry, because he literally created a generation of free-thinking kids because of Star Trek.
Well, the guy who invented the cell phone for Motorola, he designed it. He used Kirk's flip-open communicator as the prototype for that. You remember, if you're anywhere near my age, and if you went into a Safeway, you stepped on a mat, and that made the door open. Star Trek came on with the sensors that would make doors open, and now we have them. Things we just take for granted now that we have. Spock's computer became the Internet and the PC. McCoy's scanner became the MRI and the CAT scan. The first time we saw DVDs and CDs was on Star Trek. And Bluetooth. Uhura had one screwed into her ear, and Spock had one screwed into his, the Bluetooth. And that was another 35 years before we saw those, but it was on Star Trek. Now, you said, everybody borrows from everything else. Well, the first time you saw a transporter, I believe, was in the movie The Fly with David Hedison. And a fly got into the transporter chamber with her, and he became half man, half fly. But it hadn't been on a TV show. And the reason they came up with a lot of these ideas or decided to do it was budget. They couldn't afford to land the Enterprise on a planet every week, and it would take too long. He thought, if we could beam them down, that'll get us into the story so much quicker, and it'll save us a lot of money.
That's the same reason why you would build a transporter today.
I wish they would build one today.
Yeah,
boy, we could get around L.A. so much better.
Oh, man. And this is what's really, really funny. Tell me that you didn't, every time you flipped open your Motorola Razr, that you didn't think you were Kirk, right?
Oh, yeah. I kept a flip-open phone for several years after the smartphone came out because I just loved it. I loved to pull it open and flip it open. But eventually it came up with so many gadgets we had to make the move.
And the other thing that I wanted to ask you, the simplicity of the set, of the bridge. Let's just talk about the bridge. Very simple, right? Very simple. But the audience was okay with that. It wasn't like it was some technical, over-the-top attempt at technology. It was actually a very simplistic set. And I think we find it enduring, but nobody had issues with it, did they?
You know, every guest star I talked to, I interviewed everybody for these books. They were all the guest stars, and they would say when they came to that set, they felt it was a set that had been stolen from a motion picture, because for television, it was incredible. And the bridge was built into 8 sections, like a pie, wedges of a pie that you could pull out so they could move the camera in and get different angles, and then they would push that wedge back in. But all these wedges were hooked up to electricity, all the flashing lights, everything you had. So, and it was split leveled. So it was really pretty sophisticated for 1964 when they did the first pilot, and 66 when the show went on the air. We hadn't seen anything quite like that on television. Now you can look at it and think, okay, it's pretty simple. We've seen a lot of science fiction movies in the years that have come. But for then, when that show premiered, I hadn't seen anything like that. I was blown away instantly.
Now, before we head to the break, I just wanted to ask you, do you have a favorite episode?
Oh, yeah.
What is it?
I have This Side of Paradise, I think, may be my favorite episode, and you may have a clip for that. Dorothy wrote it, and she's on there talking about it for the audiobook. It's because that's the one where Spock gets shot by spores and he falls in love, and which he hadn't done before on that show. Leonard Nimoy was very nervous about that because he had just gotten a hold of the character, and now in the first season they're doing an episode where he's going to fall in love. But every episode of Star Trek was about Kirk. He's the storyteller. He's doing the captain's log. And in Gene's memos, he always said, you've got to make it about Kirk. And even when you have an episode like that, which seems like it's about Spock, it's about Kirk. They all leave the ship. He's left alone on the Enterprise, and he has to figure out a way to get them back. And so he was the driving force behind that. So when you see that, you've got great drama. You got those conflicts. What's he going to do to get the crew back? You're seeing Spock fall in love, and that poignant line at the end where he turns to Kirk and he says, for the first time in my life, I was happy.
There are so many lines, things that come to mind first. I've got to take a break here in 15 seconds. But, Captain, can you beam us up a warm cup of coffee? Things like that just stick with you over the years. Let's take our break right here. This is Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. This is our Star Trek special event, and tonight we have both Marc Cushman and Vic Mignongna are both here. All right, Vic's going to join us at the bottom of the hour. When we come back, we're going to talk about DC Fontana. We're going to play some, you know what? We'll talk about this after the break, but I've got a couple of clips, and DC left this earth last week. So we'll talk about all of that when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back, Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, our Star Trek special event. We have author Marc Cushman here. Vic Mignogna is going to be with us in a few short minutes at the bottom of the hour. And we're talking about Star Trek, all of it, all night tonight. And Mark, we've had this show booked, as you know, for a few weeks now, and with the in the middle of all of this, DC Fontana passed away on December 9th at the age of 80, and I just thought, whoa, but 80 years old, that's great, but I didn't want to put a damper on tonight. But we certainly need to celebrate, her contributions to Star Trek, and it really can't be measured, can it?
I think she was the single best writer on the original Star Trek and on Next Generation, and maybe even Babylon 5, even more so than Gene Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn, who were both great writers. But when I look at my personal favorite episodes, they seem to always have D.C. Fontana stamped on them. Journey to Babel, where we meet Spock's parents. This Side of Paradise, which we were just talking about a moment ago. Charlie X, and we just lost Robert Walker Jr., who was Charlie in Charlie X. He died, I think, the day after Dorothy. And so she really cranked out incredible scripts. And as the story editor of the show, she was rewriting a lot of the other scripts. So her stamp is definitely there in that series. And then she continued on with the animated series, Next Generation, and beyond.
And where did her foundation for science fiction come from?
She started writing Westerns. And that's when she came up with the name D.C. Fontana, because women weren't really, you didn't go to women to get Westerns or science fiction. And if she had put Dorothy Fontana up there, she probably wouldn't have been selling the scripts. But she started very early with Star Trek. She was Gene Roddenberry's secretary, and she had sold a couple Western scripts to other shows. And she said, "Could I have a crack at doing a script?" And he had a story that he'd come up with, Charlie X, and gave it to her, and that was her first script. And then she wrote another incredible episode called Tomorrow is Yesterday, where the Enterprise gets thrown back in time and it's spotted as a UFO. And jets are scrambled, and they go after it in the year 1967, and they have to beam the pilot aboard, and the whole thing. And then she did This Side of Paradise, and on and on. She just was a great imaginative writer, and she took to science fiction. She told me once that she said, Westerns and science fiction are the same to her. They're both period pieces, and they're both character stories. You get rid of a lot of the stuff when you go back to a Western and you're out there on the plains, no cell phones, nothing to help you. Well, the same thing in deep space. They got the communicators, but they're way out there. And so she loved writing those type of things.
I've got a couple of clips here I want to play. And which one do you want to do first?
This Side of Paradise, because we've mentioned the episode, and it's a shorter clip. I think it's about 2 minutes. The other one is a little bit longer. But you hear her. She just recorded her part last year. Sounds like she's in her 30s. She was still so busy teaching at AFI. She was writing a new book, and she became ill very quickly, died peacefully. We were all stunned. None of us were expecting it. But this is the episode where she got to be the story editor for Star Trek, because they were having problems with this script that Jerry Soule had written. And Gene handed it to her, and he said, "If you can rewrite this and make it work, you're going to be the new story editor on the series."
Yeah, let's check this out.
Chapter 33, Episode 25, This Side of Paradise. Teleplay by D.C. Fontana. Jill Ireland guest stars as Layla, the first woman with whom the normally unemotional Mr. Spock falls in love following the discovery of a drug-like plant. Paradise offers an examination of duty and responsibility, the dangers of repressed emotions, and a warning for the growing drug culture of the 1960s. The story behind the story. Dorothy Fontana's gamble, resigning as Roddenberry's secretary to become a full-fledged screenwriter, had paid off. Now her former boss had nothing to lose in offering her a shot at being on staff. Nonetheless, for 1966, it was a bold move. Fontana later said,
"To have a woman story editor on an action-adventure show? That was unheard of." Gene came to me and said, "We have a script that's not working, and we'd like you to do a rewrite on it. And if you can do a fast rewrite that satisfies the network and the studio, then I'll invite you to join us as story editor."
It was an offer a struggling writer who had just quit her day job could not refuse. So Fontana said,
Okay.
and what she was handed would become This Side of Paradise. She later recalled,
I looked at the script and thought about it, and there were two problems. One, the love interest was for Sulu. Nothing wrong with George Takei, and I really like George, but he wasn't one of the heavyweight stars of the show. And if you're going to have a love story, you're going to have it with one of them. And with the Spores, you could make it Spock. And you could make it a very emotional story, harking back a little to The Naked Time. What will happen when Spock is out of control? Only this time in terms of love. The other thing that was wrong with it was that the Spores, which were the infection, were in a cave, and they kind of fumbled and bounced up and down like ping pong balls. And the answer to that was, don't go in the cave. So by making them a part of a plant that was all over the planet, anybody could be infected at any time. Everybody was at risk.
With Fontana's rewrite, she had passed Roddenberry's test, and Star Trek found its new story editor.
You know what is fascinating about that is that when most people watch a series, certainly with Star Trek, it's there too. But when they watch a series, they don't understand how much thought is going into a script. It's not easy to do, and it needs to be done the correct way.
I taught screenwriting for many years at a Los Angeles area college. And the thing that always surprised me about the students is, first, they didn't know what theme was. I would ask them, and nobody knew. And secondly, they would come up with contrived mechanical drama. And Dorothy taught screenwriting as well as AFI, because a lot of thought does go into this. But really, you just have to ask yourself, what would be the greatest challenge for this character? And get into them, get deep into them under the skin. And that's what separates good writing from bad writing. And when you look at the original Star Trek, and when you look at Dorothy's scripts, you see good writing. You see the best writing.
I'm sorry, I had my cough button on. Oh, man. You got to love live radio. And certainly, this is the other part. Did Gene know? I mean, did he? Certainly, he has hopes and dreams, but did he have any idea the impact that Star Trek was going to have and the legacy that it would have for decades to come? Did he really understand that at the beginning?
None of them did. I mean, they were hoping just to get picked up at the mid-season and get picked up for another season with the goal of doing at least 5 seasons. And John D.F. Black told me that. That's why they came up with the line, the 5-year mission, is five seasons so they could have about 150 episodes. They knew they were doing something special. They all felt it, because they'd all done work for other shows, and there wasn't a show like this where you could do that type of writing. And they had such a great cast. And the premise was just so wide open to go anywhere and do anything. And Gene encouraged them to come up with stories that were risque. So they knew they were doing something special. But would it catch on? Would it last? They had no idea. And all of them were surprised to this day. When I would sit and have dinner with Dorothy and we would talk about it, she was just surprised that the legacy continued and that there's another series on now, Discovery, Star Trek Discovery. None of them predicted this.
And another thing that I find interesting is that, certainly here in Hollywood, that if you really want as close to a sure thing as getting a script picked up and getting the green light and going into production, is good science fiction, maybe some aliens, maybe an invasion on Earth, but that's a pretty surefire way of getting something, at least the door open. But if you replicate the hero's journey and do a Star Trek like picture or film or TV series, it works because it's the audience gets that idea. And I don't want to say that go out and clone something, but Star Trek had all of those elements. It had the hero's journey, it had the character development, and it was well written. Don't fix it if it's not broke, right?
Right. Well, Gene based Star Trek in a way on 2 things. One was a movie called Forbidden Planet.
Yep.
which is just an amazing movie. And if you think about it, that could have been an episode of Star Trek, but it came first. And the other thing was a book series called Horatio Hornblower, about a British naval officer back in the days of the high-mast ships going out into oceans that hadn't been explored before and islands that have never been visited before, and fighting pirates and the French and whoever and the Spanish. And so he thought, let's take that premise and put it in outer space. Now, Irwin Allen was pretty imaginative, too. He looked at Swiss Family Robinson and said, let's make it Space Family Robinson, Lost in Space. He looked at The Time Machine and said, let's do Time Tunnel. He looked at Jules Verne and said, let's do Voyage Beyond the Sea. So, but with Gene, he wanted to do more than just entertain. He wanted to educate, enlighten, and look into the future. And as you said, the crystal ball. But the crystal ball was all of his friends from NASA and JPL. So with that premise, I can't think of one. If you do, please tell me. But I can't think of a TV show that had such a wide-open premise where you could go anywhere and do anything. But the real magic of it was that the Enterprise was out where no one had gone before. No man had gone before. And so they couldn't just pick up a phone and say, hey, we need help, we need backup. They're out there. And matter of fact, they always did things where they said subspace radio, it would take a week to get a reply. So it was always on Kirk's shoulders to make decisions. And that was, we had not seen something like that on television for sure.
When I was a kid and I would watch a specific episode and they would pull up, oh, this is an uncharted planet, right? This is I would always hear that statement and think to myself, how could everything be undiscovered? How could these be uncharted? That is a vision of the future for Gene and for DC that is spot on. Because today, where we now know that there is 100 billion planets in our Milky Way alone that are Earth-like, right? That's a crazy number. But you can't chart all of those planets. You can't name all of those planets. And if you and I were out on our starship cruising around and we pull up to something, it is going to be uncharted, right? And it's crazy to me now.
If you're pushing to the new frontier, which the Enterprise was. It wasn't guarding the Earth. It wasn't sitting back in discovered territory. It's out on the actual edge of the frontier, going further and further out there. And as you said, those numbers are true. And those are in the proposal that Gene wrote that sold the series to Lucille Ball, and then she sold it to NBC, Herb Sala, who worked for her, is that you have millions of planets. And so even if you think only one out of a million, you have billions. So if only one out of a million could support life, you're still going to have thousands and thousands of planets that could support life. So that he said, we can go anywhere.
Didn't Gene, I could be wrong here, correct me, but didn't Gene have the Drake equation in that original pitch?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what perked up everybody's ears, is they saw the potential. Other shows that were on at the time, and excellent shows, but you look at The Fugitive. Well, how many different buses can you get off of and different towns can you go to before it starts feeling all the same and it feels formula? But this thing, you just keep pushing through that barrier.
And isn't that fascinating? Because as adults, we acquire knowledge, right? We understand things now. But this is 50 years ago, right? We are achieving scientific knowledge today at a breakneck speed. But this is the stuff that Gene was basing everything on back then. We know that now, but to have that vision 50 years ago, I think is absolutely extraordinary.
He was definitely ahead of his time. And, that's why I wanted to do these books, is because when he gave me access to his memos, and we're talking thousands and thousands of memos, hundreds for almost every episode, and you read his thoughts. He would dictate these things late at night after he got back from the studio. He'd pour himself a drink, light a cigarette, pick up the dictaphone, and he would start making up a story. were giving notes on a script that had been written. And when you read his words and his ideas in these actual memos, it's quite staggering. And the same thing for Dorothy. And the same thing for Gene Kuhn and Bob Justman and all of them. But Gene was definitely the visionary, and he was leading the charge.
As a writer of science fiction, and certainly you followed everything that went down in the late 60s and early 70s with, the Apollo program and exploration and future bases on the moon and hotels, satellites, and a Mars base, and everything was the flying cars, right? Everything was the future. And then the brakes got put on everything in 1974, and everything came to a screeching halt. Did you ever think that we would not have returned to the moon, and it would have taken until 2024 to do this?
No. Yeah, I know. It's amazing. And, Trump seems to be determined that we're going to get back out there. He's kind of doing what Kennedy was doing and wanting to get it back on track. So we got to give him some credit for that, whether you like him or not. But it just became dormant. And I understand why. The country went into a recession. Everybody was worried about money. There were so many problems here on Earth that the attention came back here. But that's one of the problems. I think one of the things that united the world, the entire world was united in August of 1969 when man first walked on the moon. And people were watching it all around the globe. And when Apollo 13 was in trouble, people were watching it all around the globe. And you had people in China and people in Europe and people in Japan all worrying about these astronauts. And it took people's attention off of all of our bickering and all of the things that go on here and put it out there. And I hope we can do that again, because we need to more than ever. I wish we had Gene here. he would try to find a way to get us to get our heads back into the stars.
Well, there is something that I find very interesting that's going down today, and I cannot help but think of Star Trek every time I hear this, and which is the Space Force. And it seems that, right, it seems that we're finally taking that approach, everything that Star Trek presented to us where we should have been 20 years ago, back in 1967.
The scientists have known for a long time, and I've watched shows where scientists are interviewed, and they would go to Bush and they would go to Obama, and they would say, look, North Korea has satellites flying over our country. And if they have a bomb on one of those satellites and it comes down far enough into the atmosphere, it can knock out our electrical grids. And we'll have no power anywhere. Everything will fuse. And there'll be no TV, no radio, no cars will work, nothing. And we have to have a defense against this. And all the other presidents just said, oh, that's science fiction. We don't care. Well, now you got some people in there who are starting to care, and they're looking at these things. And I'm inspired by that. I'm happy to hear that they're starting to look at it, not just for defensive purposes, but for positive and peaceful purposes too. But that's the new frontier, and it's up over us right now. There's so much stuff flying around up there. So the idea of the Space Force, I think, is something that I thought would have happened quite a while ago, and I think it's something that's crucially needed.
Do you think that the Space Force is the beginning of a federation like Star Trek, that we are now finally going to try to get interstellar and start exploring out there? This could be the beginning.
I think so, and I think it's what we all thought was going to happen in the 70s and the 80s, and it got delayed. The whole thing got stalled. But, it all comes, usually things, that most technology is advancements come out of military. And then they find peaceful ways to use it, So, so many things, even the Frisbee came from the military, So it's, we can say, hey, let's just be peaceful and all that stuff. But worrying about how to protect ourselves usually advances the technology, and then we find other things to do with it. And God knows what's out there. God knows. And we've been turning a blind eye to it for so long.
And that's exactly my point, where Star Trek presented not like the other Alien from Mars, movies, the great B movies from the 50s and 60s, but intelligent life and civilizations, and I'm quoting from the TV series, out there. Today, it seems like that is front page news now, looking for alien life. What do you make of that? Do you think that ET's going to get here first and present themselves, or are we going to go out there and find it?
I think ET has already been here, and I'm sure you feel that way too. I think the reason they haven't revealed themselves is because, would you? I mean, if they monitor our television, would you want to reveal yourself? We're not mature enough, and we seem like we were on the verge of it 50 years ago. And then mankind took a big step backwards, several steps backwards. But I think it's about time we start taking some steps forward. And I think one of the things that may push it is I think people are getting very fed up with a lot of things that are going on, and it's going to get us to unite and look towards something positive out there. I don't think we have to look too far and too hard to find ET. I think they found us, and I think they're pretty close by.
Yeah, it's a very simple thing. We're out there looking for planets every single day, right? That's what we're doing. We're searching. Well, ET's been doing the same thing, probably 1 million or 2 years in front of us, right? Mm-hmm. And they've known.
And I'll tell you, Gene really believed in interdimensional travel. He felt that we're being visited by people coming from another dimension or using interdimensional transportation to get here. More so than going through vast reaches of space. That was something he was very intrigued by, and he thought was a real possibility.
Well, and we're going to head towards a break here, and then we'll bring in Vic, but the concept of the warp drive. And today, this is real physics is taking a look at this now, and the concepts, the numbers work, right? A warp drive in concept, in theory, is absolutely possible. And every time I hear a physicist, either on this show or otherwise, speak about warp drives and how they work and how the concept of it, where you're not actually traveling, you're just cutting space out, right? You're just the distance in front of you. So you're not even achieving speeds. But all of this is because of Star Trek, and that part blows my mind.
Yeah, I mean, there were science fiction movies and books that went in that area before and called it hyperdrive or whatever, but Star Trek brought it to a mass audience. The average science fiction book back in the 60s, when the first Star Trek went on, sold, and I'm talking about the big books, the Highland's books and Asimov's books, sold maybe 60, 70,000 copies. And then they started doing Star Trek fiction, and they were selling 600,000 copies of each one. Star Trek really jump-started people's interest because it was coming into them every week and then every day in reruns. So it did much more than a movie could do. I mean, as good as 2001 is, if you sat in a room with 10 people and said, how many have seen this movie, maybe one would raise their hand. Not your audience, but just people off the street, right?
Sure.
But if you say, how many of you have seen Star Trek, almost every hand goes up.
That's right.
So that's the impact it had and continues to have.
Well, and you only have to give somebody an idea. That's all you have to do. Warp drive. Mm-hmm. Give them the idea, they're going to run with it. The communicator. Give them the idea. CAT scans, right? Just give them the idea, and they'll figure it out. The hardest part is getting the idea. It's not implementing it. It's getting the idea first. And Star Trek can take credit for so many of those things that we absolutely take for granted today. You ready to take a break?
Yep.
Let's do that. And when we come back, Vic Mignongna is going to be joining us. This is Fade to Black. It's our Star Trek special event. I am your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Network and KGRA, The Planet. Stay with us. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Continuing our Star Trek special event tonight. Vic Mignongna is a veteran voice actor for more than 300 animated series and video games. He's also a longtime music composer, producer, and performer, and the executive producer of the highly popular web series Star Trek Continues, where he plays Captain Kirk. I would like to welcome back to Fade to Black, Vic Mignongna. Vic, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good. How are you, Jimmy?
It's great to hear your voice, and I was just sitting here thinking during the break. The last time I saw you, we had dinner at
yes, we did, up on Ventura Boulevard.
Yeah, Jerry's Deli. That's right. Yes, Jerry's Deli in the hood.
Great.
In the hood. Great to have you back, and I want to let everybody know that Vic is a very serious working actor, and right now he's in Texas. Just got out of rehearsal for a play, and is joining us now. But you're how do they say it? You're what do they say with theater? You're walking on wood. How do they say that?
I don't know. I don't think maybe I've been out of theater for too long. I don't know that saying, but yeah, I just finished rehearsal for a show I'm doing here, and didn't want to miss the opportunity to talk with you, Jimmy. So I'm just getting out of the thing. I'm sorry if my audio doesn't sound great, but
well, see,
but I'm happy to join you.
It's the technology of Star Trek that is allowing you to join us tonight.
You got that right, my friend. You got that right.
And hey, Vic, let me ask you this. I'm going to ask you a very serious question.
Ask me.
Do you put on your Captain Kirk costume and run around the house when you're alone? Tell me the truth.
The absolute truth is no, but I will tell you that I have a very nice plush Captain Kirk robe, and like it's like a yellow, command gold robe with the black trim and the braid on the arms, and I do wear that when I get up in the morning to have some coffee out of my Star Trek coffee mug.
Now, Mark. Mark is with us, by the way, Vic. Mark.
Yes, Mark.
Mark, are you surprised by that statement from Vic?
Not at all. Not at all. And, what's funny is people say the original uniforms looked a little like pajamas. And I would think Vic would sleep in it. Hey, Vic, do you drink Fade to Black coffee out of that mug?
I should. I knew there was something missing from my life.
Now, okay, let's put our serious hat on for a second. And, Vic, I always enjoy when you're on the show. But
thank you, sir.
We've talked so much about Star Trek Continues, but I don't think I've asked you this. When you have the foundation of the original series to look back on, to observe, and to study, does that make Star Trek Continues easy? Did it make it easy?
Oh, I would say definitely not. In fact, if you think about it, if you make something out of thin air, there is nothing to compare it to. But with Star Trek, you've got a very, very strong original series, formula that was magical and has stood the test of time. And there have been dozens and dozens of Star Trek fan productions over the years. But I know that I'm partial, but I think that it's not easy to do something like that to the level of the original series. To tell the kind of stories, to craft the kind of stories, episodes, casting, editing, makeup, sound design, effects, all of it, props, sets, actors, all of it. It's not easy to do that. And I'm very, very proud of my team and what we've done.
I would say it takes about, and I'm sure you've heard this over and over again, but it takes about 5 minutes into Pilgrim of Eternity to then move past that this is Star Trek continues. Right? You immediately get absorbed into the atmosphere, into the characters, and you're just watching Star Trek.
Well, I hope so. That was the plan all along, Jimmy. You know, like we've talked about before, you know, anybody can go to Lowe's and buy a bunch of lumber and build a set. And anybody can make costumes. But what made Star Trek special, what made it of the quality and caliber and depth that we're still loving it and talking about it 50-some years later, were the stories. It was the storytelling. It was the crafting of a thematic morality play in a very creative, imaginative sci-fi setting. And when you set the bar that high, it's not all that easy. And when I created Star Trek Continues, I thought I don't want to just make another Star Trek fan production. I want it to be the kind of quality storytelling that I remembered and loved so much about the original series. And I'm so gratified when so many people say, "Oh my gosh," like I feel like I'm watching episodes that were locked in a vault 50 years ago.
And let's talk about Captain Kirk for a second, and because Shatner is one of the most imitated voices out there. His cadence, and it's always good for a laugh. And when somebody does it well, we appreciate it, and it's so recognizable. Your approach, and this is my opinion, but your approach wasn't to do that, but yet you kind of did. Right? There's something. And it's not a criticism at all. What I'm saying is, we accept you as Kirk, but you're not doing Shatner's Kirk, right? Was that conscious?
Well, here was my approach to it, Jimmy. My approach was, I love Bill Shatner, and I love Captain Kirk, and the last thing I would ever want to do would be for someone to think that I was mocking or satirizing or somehow doing a parody of the Shatner cadence of speech and movement and gestures. So my goal was to make people feel like they were watching a continuation of the original series, had it never been canceled. So my goal for myself, as well as the other actors who were playing all the other iconic characters, was to do our best to play them honorably and authentically and not do some stereotype of the characters. A lot of the characters have had their own stereotypes. George Takei has been stereotyped over the years, and so has Scotty
Doohan.
Yep. And DeForest Kelly as McCoy, and of course Shatner. But I didn't want anybody for a minute to think that we were making fun of them. The best observation that I hear from people is when they say, "I feel like you weren't imitating Shatner, you were channeling him." It was more subtle, as it was intended to be. And I think I told you this before. When we would shoot episodes, I would pull my first AD aside before we would take a scene, and I would say, "Now, Scotty Whitehurst was our AD."
Oh, did we just lose him?
I think so.
Oh.
Well, it's that Star Trek technology. He's on another planet. It's a long ways away.
I don't know about you, Mark, but I was on the edge of my seat. Okay.
I can finish that story because I had that conversation with Vic, and we'll get him back in a second. But he said, if I'm laying it on a little too heavy, let me know. Give me a signal. Let me pull it back down. And when you watch that show, I mean, Vic isn't like doing an impression of Bill Shatner, but the way he'll turn, the way his posture, the way he'll look through the camera or right by the camera, you get that Bill Shatner thing. And they put that little cut of light across his eyes a lot of times. So you do feel it, and that's one of the wonderful things. We did a very interesting screening. We showed Mirror Mirror from the original show, and then we showed Fairest of Them All, which picks up the story right at the end of Mirror Mirror. And so we showed the first episode. We went into an intermission. Everybody came back and got in their seats, a few hundred people. And we started the second, the fairest of them all. And most of these people had not seen Star Trek Continues. And there was a gasp in the room because the lighting was the same, the sets were the same, the music, everything was such a perfect match. But the talent was so superb. At first you say, well, that guy doesn't look that much like Nimoy or whatever. But after, as you just said, Jimmy, after about 5 minutes, the suspension of belief is gone. You're just into it. And you're able to just accept it because they are channeling these characters, and the writing is just key, and it's right on the mark.
We have Vic back. And Vic, it's talking about the channeling aspect of this. If there's one thing that you dialed in, though, was Kirk's sarcastic wit. You laugh, right? Sarcastically. But that's not an easy thing to do. How did you approach that part of it? Because it's comedy and drama and sarcasm in storytelling.
You know, it's funny you should mention that, Jimmy, because most Star Trek fan films miss. That's something very, very, very much a part of the original series that a lot of fan productions miss, and that is the humor. The humor and the sarcasm and the subtlety of the characters. Spock is more than just saying that's illogical or fascinating. And McCoy is much more than saying he's dead, Jim.
Right.
And, Scotty is much more than, I cannot do it, Captain. I need more time, need more power. The characters are more than that. And to get good actors to play these roles, as we did, we were able to, and good writing, by the way, and Marc Cushman here wrote the script for our 5th episode, Divided We Stand, and having people write the stories who know the voices and understand what they sound like and how they relate and interact was invaluable.
There's another aspect to this that I wanted to address. I know that, Vic, you and I have talked about it with Star Trek Continues, but it's very important, which is the music. And yes, and the music in the original Star Trek is like the 5th Beatle. And
Absolutely.
I truly mean what I am saying here. And as a writer, and you know that you're going to have those elements and that foundation. I keep saying foundation, but it's the reality of it. And if you know that you've got those cues and you've got that music to back up your storytelling, it's all good.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah, let me tell you, Jimmy. I have been involved in music twice as long as I've been voice acting. Since I was about 17. I started writing music and singing and playing the piano and composing, and I loved the music from the original series. And whenever we would shoot an episode, I had already in many, many cases picked out the exact cues in my mind that I wanted to use to punctuate the scenes. And that is so very important. Knowing the mood and the flavor and the tone of what you want to communicate emotionally and being able to find just the right music cue, and then being able to edit and manipulate that cue to match your scene the same way that the music editor in the original series would have done, because as you know, they didn't write original music for every episode. They would often regurgitate cues from previous episodes, and they would have to find just the right emotional tone for the scene.
The tempo.
And
yes.
And I hope this doesn't sound cocky, but music is my thing. And I feel like I have a really good handle on choosing the right music, knowing how to adjust it and edit it to match the scene and the beats of the scene and the character's reaction just right. And then as you may or may not remember, Jimmy, on our fourth episode, a gentleman contacted me who teaches composition at the Juilliard School in New York City, and he is a huge fan of Star Trek and Star Trek Continues. He offered to write original music for us and even had a full orchestra at his disposal. And so from episode 4 on, we had original music written, composed, and produced with a full orchestra for Star Trek Continues.
Yeah, if you go to, I'm going to tell the audience, if you go to StarTrekContinues.com, there's an excellent documentary that Vic put together on the recording sessions with the orchestra, putting the music together. And then that's when it all kind of makes sense to everybody, because you're like, oh, man, this sounds like an orchestra. This sounds like custom stuff. This sounds like, right? And then then you watch the documentary, and it's like it all makes sense, of course.
Yeah, because, nowadays, Jimmy, most television music scores are done with keyboards and synthesizers. And there are a series of pads and sounds. But back then, there were no such instruments and samplers and digital instruments and soft synths and stuff. So everything was real instruments. So when Andy Farber contacted me and wanted to write music for our series, I thought, well, I would love that, but you can't recreate that with synthesizers. It would have to be a real orchestra. And as luck would have it, Andy Farber had access to a real orchestra, and that's exactly what we got. And his cues sound just like original Star Trek cues, except they're not. They're original.
And Mark, when we come back after the break, Mark, I want to talk about Divided We Stand. Vic and I have talked about Divided We Stand quite a bit. It's an amazing episode. But going back to the music aspect of this, now you've also got that to do and to work with in Star Trek Continues. Where did the idea for Divided We Stand come from?
Well, I can tell you that very easily. The idea came from the fact that some of my favorite episodes of the original series were the episodes where they went to a period in time, whether it was Nazi Germany or ancient Rome or the Depression, whatever. I loved those episodes, the gangsters of the 20s. And so I started thinking one day, what's a time period they never went to? Well, the obvious answer was the Civil War. And as I started thinking about the idea, I thought, wouldn't it be great if Kirk, who's from Iowa, who would probably be in the Union, and McCoy, who was a Southern gentleman from Georgia and would probably be in the Confederacy, what if we crafted a story where the two of them were in the Civil War and they're best friends, but they're supposed to be enemies? And, and what would that look like? And we fleshed out the idea and gave it to Mark, and he wrote an amazing screenplay.
And what I did, Jimmy, was, what we were talking about earlier, about challenging the character, looking at a character and saying, what would be the worst thing that could happen to this character, the biggest challenge they would have, which a lot of writers don't think in that way, but that's the best way to think when you're writing for episodic TV or movies. And I thought, well, Kirk is this virile guy. He's a leader. He stands tall. What if he got shot in the leg and they amputated his leg? And McCoy's there to try to get him out of his depression, get him back on his feet, literally, and so forth. And so by taking Vic's idea of let's go back to the Civil War, and then my idea about putting Kirk into something that he's never had to deal with, can he still be a leader if he only has one leg? And the obvious line was, a man can stand taller even if he only has one leg, if he has a reason, a purpose, and so we went in that direction.
Amazing.
I think it made a very powerful story.
How did you, Mark, you've got limitations here. You don't have a Steven Spielberg budget, that you're working within. And this is a cinematic, huge Right. Mark, did you have to write inside of, or did you just go for it and hope that Vic would handle it in the end? I mean, how do you do that?
It's like when they were writing for the original Star Trek, and you had Gene Roddenberry, and you had Bob Justman, who was taking those scripts to the set and finding ways to make it work. I was writing for a master magician, Vic Mignongna, and I knew he would be able to do it. You know, most actors, I got to be one-legged, I got to bend my leg back there and strap it and do all this stuff for half the episode. But I knew Vic would do it, and he would hop to it. And then Vic was able to arrange to get these reenactment groups who do Civil War battles to get involved with the production so they could go out on location and have all these men in uniforms and everything else. And that was one of the reasons we wanted to do that story, is because we knew we had that, we could put that into the show and give it that production value.
Yeah, Jimmy, if you think about it, you know, there are Civil War reenactments annually all over the country. And so, you know, the greatest stroke of luck was that if we could hook up with one of these Civil War reenactments, and as luck would have it again, there was a reenactment called the Battle of Olustee Creek, 45 minutes from our studio in South Georgia, and we took the DP, we took a camera, and myself and little Scotty Whitehurst, who played little Billy Palmerton, and we went to Olustee Creek and shot B-roll of hundreds of people, running across a field, and cannons and horses, and, you know, a production value that we could never, even the original series, could never afford. And it was just luck that the time period we wanted to tell this story in happens to have thousands of people every year who do these very authentic reenactments.
The first time that I saw the episode, and I saw these panoramic epic scenes unfolding, thinking, how did they do this? You know, and I'm thinking it's CG. Are they dropping bodies in? Is that what's going on? And then you realize that it's shot, right? Like it's real. And how did you pull this off? Well, that's how you do it. You've got to get creative, don't you?
And not only that, but you know, when you watch a lot of old Hollywood movies, the uniforms are always too clean, too perfect. You know, these guys, they had grungy uniforms. Right. They had been out there in the dirt, and they had the rifles and everything. And so it's and authentic rifles. So you have that. You get able to bring that onto the screen.
You know what else, Jimmy? When we shot the B-roll, obviously we did not interrupt the reenactment at all. You know, we stayed at a distance and shot all kinds of big, huge footage of armies and cannons and horses, like I said. But if you think about it, there were several scenes that we had to be able to choreograph, like actual moments in the script of, like, Kirk in the battle. And it can't just be me on an empty battlefield or sitting around the campfire. It can't just be me and McCoy sitting around the campfire. So we actually connected with a reenactment group locally, about 15 or 20 people, and they agreed to come to our studio 3 days before the Olustee Creek reenactment, which they were on their way to, and they set up tents outside the studio. And we were able to use them like the group of soldiers going through the woods when they come across Kirk and McCoy. And we were able to choreograph them and block them and give them little lines of dialogue and have them in the background behind our actors to fill up the scenes. And the way it worked out was just perfect.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary episode. We need to take a break right here. Vic, stay right there.
Yes,
Mark, you stay right there. This is Fade to Black. This is our Star Trek special event. I am your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Network and KGRA, The Planet. More with Mark and Vic when we come back after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Fade to Black, our Star Trek special event. And what's so great about this? This is our last broadcast after 6 years. We are now entering our 7th year of broadcast. And Vic, it's pretty cool to have both you and Mark here on such a special night discussing this. And it's pretty cool. You never know what the future is going to bring, and it just landed on tonight. And Mark, thank you so much for doing this with us. Vic, I wanted to ask you this. I hit Mark with this earlier. Do you have a favorite episode from the original series? Oh, man, we lost Vic again, Mark.
He's thinking about it.
Let me bring him back on. The Star Trek technology is okay. I think we got you back. Vic, I asked Mark earlier.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you. You can hear us, right? Oh.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Vic. Oh, no. I don't know what's going on. Mark, you got to love live radio. So
I'll feel for you.
Yeah.
I'll feel for you. I have another favorite, Shore Leave.
Wait. That was, you just stole, oh, man.
I stole your favorite episode?
Yeah, Shore Leave was mine. Vic, do we have you back? Okay, I'm going to reset with Vic one more time, and we'll see if we can pull this off. This is technology at its finest right here. Shore Leave, for me, was right there, and I definitely want to get Vic's favorite show before we move on. Let's try to do this again.
Okay.
Vic, can you hear us? Oh, no.
Got me?
We can hear you. I'm going to have to text questions to Vic.
Wait.
That might work.
No, I can hear you. You can.
Okay. All right. Let's reset. Vic, I'd asked Mark earlier what his favorite episode was from the original series. What's yours?
Well, mine's rather obscure. Everybody loves The City on the Edge of Forever and Doomsday Machine and Mirror Mirror and Balance of Terror, but my favorite is an obscure one from the 3rd season called Requiem for Methuselah. I absolutely loved that episode. I don't know if you know the one where there's an epidemic on the Enterprise, and they need a substance called Ritalin to combat the epidemic, and they find it on this planet, and the planet seems to be deserted. But when they go there, they find this man who seems to be living there all by himself, and then he introduces them to this woman who is supposedly his heir, his adopted heir, and they keep finding all of these amazing artifacts around his house, like a Gutenberg Bible, and a Brahms lullaby, and a painting from Da Vinci, and you end up finding out that he was all of these men through history. And the woman who Kirk obviously falls in love with, as you would expect, turns out to be an android, because this man created this woman. He was immortal, and so he wanted to create a perfect woman who would be as immortal as he was, to be his partner forever. And Kirk falls in love with her, and so Kirk and the man have it out, and the woman dies because she is so torn by her romantic love for Kirk and her fatherly love for this man. And there are some of the most beautiful lines in that episode. Spock said, there wasn't enough time for her to adjust to the horrible contradictions of her newfound emotion. She couldn't bear to hurt either of you. The joys of love made her human, and the agonies of love destroyed her.
Isn't it remarkable that this is one of the more obscure episodes, not an episode people would think of immediately when you say, what is your favorite? And yet, hearing Vic tell you about the story and the texture and the emotion, you realize that even the less-known episodes of Star Trek were so incredible.
Oh my gosh, yes. And let me just tell you, if I may, Jimmy, the reason that I love that episode, the reason it's my favorite, is because at the end of the episode, you see Kirk sitting in his quarters, defeated and ashamed of himself. You never see Captain Kirk, the hero, the problem solver, the day saver. And he was sitting there just defeated and deflated, and he was so embarrassed about the way he behaved. And he even says that in the episode, how if only he could forget. And they put on such a poor show, and he felt so foolish. And I remember even as a little boy thinking, wow, Captain Kirk is a human just like us. He has regrets and loss and shame for things that he wished he'd have done differently. That episode was actually the impetus for our fourth episode, The White Iris, which explores Kirk's humanity and his regrets and his frailty. It was also a springboard into Wrath of Khan at the end, because in this episode, Kirk is collapsed on the table. He's finally sleeping, and Spock does the Vulcan touch on his head, and he says one word: forget.
Right.
Yes.
Forget
about it.
Right.
Forget the pain. And then they use that in Wrath of Khan at the end before Spock dies, where he touches McCoy's head and he says, "Remember."
Yes.
Which brings us to the third movie.
That's right.
So even I don't want to say a minor episode, but one that's maybe not as well known. Look at what it did.
There's another way to view Star Trek, and if we go back, I'm going to ask both of you the same question. I'll throw this to Vic first, if you don't mind, Mark. But it's that today, where we have so many films suggesting alien contact, where it seems that humanity is getting acclimated to this possibility, right? So the day that it does really, really, really happen, the shock is not going to be that extreme. And Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry, do you think that that Gene was kind of suggesting to us how to handle alien contact, and when this does happen, the prime directive, right? Is this a way to throw a softball pitch, right, to the world, and help us for the day that it actually does happen? Do you think Gene was conscious of that?
Mark, do you want to go first? Or you want me to go?
Go, and then I have my answer ready.
I don't think so. I think that Gene wanted more than anything to make commentary about the things of the day that were going on, issues of the day, political, philosophical, moral, ethical, and he used Star Trek as the vehicle to address those issues. That's absolutely what I personally believe. I think that Gene wanted to believe that in the future, mankind would come together and be unified, and they would reach out into space, unified as one human race, to explore and connect with new worlds and new species. But even in the course of doing that, all of the greatest stories of Star Trek, the original series in particular, were moral stories and ethical questions and social issues. And as I read Mark's book, what a great segue, right, Mark? As I recorded Mark's book, These Are the Voyages, as I did the audio book, I was so struck with how strongly Roddenberry felt about that. How much conviction he had about wanting to tell a certain story or communicate a certain issue or address a certain, topic that was taboo on its face. But by couching it in an imaginative sci-fi setting, he was able to get away with a lot.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Mark, what do you think? Do you think that Gene was giving us a little a softball pitch on alien contact and how we needed to deal with it in the future?
It depends on the time frame. Vic is absolutely right about when the original Star Trek was being made. Gene knew there was life on other planets. He believed it. How could you not? I mean, he sat with all these scientists. He looked at the mathematical formulas of how many planets are out there. He had been an Air Force pilot. He had been a commercial airline pilot. He had had encounters with UFOs. He believed it, but he wasn't really trying to prepare us for that. He was trying to civilize television. He wrote so many westerns, and he was so appalled by how careless we are at dispatching people to the great unknown, killing people on TV, hitting people over the head with the butt of a gun, and they get up 10 minutes later with a headache instead of a concussion and brain damage. And so he was always trying to put more realism forward in his show and teach us in watching how they dealt with alien life, how we could deal with life here on our planet, with other countries and races and so forth. Now, but he changed. I have a new book coming out. This is not a plug for the book. This is just to answer your question. I've now done These Are the Voyages 4 and 5, which cover the 1970s. And 4 is out now. 5 comes out early next year, I hope. It's done. Hopefully it'll be in print in about 3 months. And he was doing a project that I cover in great detail in that book, along with Star Trek, the motion picture, and so forth, called The Nine. And he went to New York State and met with this group who believed in alien life and believed that alien life had been here, as most of us do. And they had a channeler. And through this channeler, he was able to talk to the Nine from another dimension who were preparing to come to Earth. And the reason they were hiring him to write this script, this group were hiring him at the request of the Nine, was to prepare mankind for this encounter that was going to come, because they didn't want to come and get shot at with missiles. They knew what our tendency was. So they thought if a movie came out, it would help set the groundwork for them coming in. And in this book, I had the transcripts of him in this channeler, and the questions he's asking the Nine are incredible, and the responses he gets are chilling. And it's a rather lengthy chapter, and I'll just say that much as a tease, but I was very emotionally affected doing the research, writing this chapter, channeling Gene's words through his memos and so forth about this as he was writing this screenplay to prepare us for this encounter, a third encounter.
I have interviewed a few people that were directly involved with the Nine.
I bet you have.
And this is the thing. We've done a lot of coverage about that, and it's a fascinating part of American history. And it's who was there too. That was you had some of the richest families in America, and industrialists, real players.
Steven Spielberg was there, and this is right before he did Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He was there, observing these things and doing research.
And the occult aspect of Gene's life, or his interest in it, and he wasn't the only one, right? You can go back to Parsons of JBL and so forth. But there was a real interest and research into this, and the Nine was an extraordinary event, and which ultimately, which came out of that, when you think about the families, the money, the people that were there, they were the movers and shakers of America, and did that have a play in the way things were going in this country? It's that was a pretty interesting evening that they had there, for sure.
And I talked to Susan Sackett. I talked to Gene about it before he passed. I talked to Susan Sackett not long ago, and she's quoted in the book. I talked to Dorothy Fontana about it, and she's quoted because they were so closely involved with Gene through all these years. And they told me that Gene went into these meetings a non-believer, and he came out believing. And yet his questions are so respectable and so well thought out. You wouldn't think he's a non-believer, but he took this job for money. And by the time he came out of it, his feelings had been changed from what he saw, experienced, heard, and the information that was conveyed to him.
Yeah, you had one of the big players in this was Arthur Young, right? And he invented the Bell helicopter, right? Yeah. And if you think about, the DuPonts were there, Mary Bancroft, from Dow Jones, right?
Mm-hmm. Wow,
that's who was there. Did you know about this, Vic?
No, I did not.
And yet I do want to just interject and say Vic is absolutely right. Everything he said, in the way you asked the question, and you were talking about the original series, Gene did not believe at that point that we had been visited from alien life. He didn't dispute it. He was open-minded about it, but he didn't believe, and what he was writing was to help us get along with each other at that time.
And I think that's also one of the reasons why all of the races and quote unquote aliens that they encountered throughout the galaxy. Did you notice, Jimmy, how they're always humanoid?
Absolutely.
They're always humanoids. They're like us, close enough to us to have problems like we do. Only Kirk and Spock and McCoy and the Federation are able to comment on these issues and maybe help these other civilizations through issues that are very similar to the ones we were dealing with.
And there's something that we almost touched upon this. We got past it, but it's this. The concern of the way that, say, Columbus or other invading states would go into other countries and mess up a culture was something that Gene dealt with every time that they did encounter another planet or another culture, not to handle it the way that we did, right? And this was something that I think was pretty out front and was a concern for Gene.
Sure, I guess you're speaking of the Prime Directive.
Yes.
The whole idea of non-interference with the normal social development of a civilization.
And remember, Gene had been a bomber pilot in World War II, and he had been a sergeant, worked his way up to sergeant on LAPD. He witnessed the worst of mankind. And that's so when he was doing the original Star Trek, he was trying to help us survive. But by the time he did the 9 script and was going into Next Generation, he changed, because then he really became a believer as far as the fact that we had been visited and what the intent was and how we needed to prepare.
Vic,
in a positive way.
Yeah, Vic, I wanted to ask you, because you've done so much research into the original series, going back and doing the companion audiobook, and now you're you're going really deep. What did you learn from doing the audiobook that you didn't know before?
Oh, my goodness.
When you thought that you thought you knew it all.
That would be a whole nother show, Jimmy. That would be a completely separate show. I learned so much about the making of this show and the people that made it, the struggles they encountered, the challenges they overcame. Mark did such an incredible job with these books. And, I've had people that actually read the books, Mark, and then they listened to the audiobook and they were like, I felt like I never read the book. Like it was all new and fresh again. And
add me to that
was
list.
Because, of course,
when they sent the first few chapters over to me to listen to, I thought, I don't want to listen to these. I wrote the books. I know every word, I thought. And I turned it on thinking I'd listen to a few minutes. I was mesmerized. I could not stop listening.
Where can everybody go?
Jimmy, and what we did was I brought in people to be the voice of Gene Roddenberry and Bob Justman and Jerry Finnerman. In some cases, our own Star Trek Continues production team voiced their counterparts from the original series. And then a lot of original contributors too, like Dorothy. Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. Where we could, we plugged in Dorothy Fontana recording her own excerpts, and Clint Howard recording his memories from Corbomite Maneuver, the episode he did when he was 8 years old, and Adam Nimoy recorded his dad's excerpts, and Chris Doohan recorded his dad's excerpts, and Rod Roddenberry even did a foreword. So when you listen to the audiobook, you feel like you're sitting in a room with these people, and they are in their own voice, in their own words, telling you the story of the making of this TV series.
Mark, where can everybody
go? In answer
to
your question, Jimmy,
yes.
I learned so much about the behind the scenes that I didn't know, and I was to steal a word from Mark, I was mesmerized.
Where can everybody go and find the audiobooks?
TheseAreTheVoyages.com.
It's that simple.
They can go to they can go to JacobsRoundMediaGroup.com, but I think TheseAreTheVoyages.com is a shortcut, or just type in These Are the Voyages audiobook and my name or Vic's name, and it'll take you right to the publisher. The audiobook is available as a download for your mobile devices or your computer. It's 28 hours long.
Wow.
And you got a driving trip to take this with you. Man, you'll hear, this is the creation of Star Trek, the whole first season. It's the first book, and with a cast of 80. But you can also get it as on a DVD, as to play in your Blu-ray player, or that also plays in your PC, and that comes with the artwork and the whole thing. So either of those are available at JacobsRoundMediaGroup.com or TheseAreTheVoyages.com.
I can't imagine how much production goes into 24 hours of audiobook.
Oh, no, you can't. And you know what? I got to tell you, Jimmy, when Jacobs Brown asked, when Marc Cushman and Jacobs
pleasure
Brown,
at the same time.
Go ahead, Vic.
When Marc Cushman and Jacobs Brown asked me to do the audiobook, you know, Jimmy, if I'd have sat in my studio and just recorded the whole audiobook myself, I could have done it, in, I don't know, maybe a month or two, with at my own pace, and I wouldn't have to schedule anybody. I could just do it myself, like most audiobooks are done. But I had this idea of casting people to be the voice of the actual characters in the book. And I thought it would make it so much more fun to listen to, and it did, but it effectively quadrupled my workload. Because, as Mark said, when it was all said and done, we had 80 different people's voices in this audiobook, and even original music. I wanted to have music bumpers in and out of the chapters. Well, you can't use the original Star Trek music because it's copyrighted. But, as luck would have it, we talked about it a little while ago, we had original music written and produced for Star Trek Continues, so I was able to use our cues, our music cues, which are all original compositions in between the chapters.
Mark, I wanted to ask you, normally I would take a break right here. I'm going to let the network know I'm not taking a break. We're going to keep going and until Vic starts to complain. Is this? We can take a break later. Mark, where did the idea? Where did the idea come from for Gene for the root race? Did he ever talk about that?
No, I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you there. But no, that's one thing he never talked to me about. I learned much from his memos. I I had a couple different recordings, interview sessions with Gene, and I saw him on many other occasions and pitched to him at Next Generation and so forth. But that was one subject we didn't bring up.
Because the root race was the foundation of all of the, the Star Trek civilizations that they encountered.
Yeah. And Vic said it very well. At that time when we were doing the original show, Gene wanted to do more alien races that did not resemble humans, but at that time he was trying to communicate to humans and save the planet. I mean, go back in time, get in your time machine and go back to 1966, 67, 68, 69, or even back to 64 when they started doing the first pilot. And we were in the Cold War. Vietnam was going on. The country was coming apart at the seams. It just really seemed like we weren't going to make it. And Gene, having been an Army pilot and a police officer, he had his doubts. So he was trying to do something that might save the world. Now, that sounds very grand, but truly, that's what he wanted to do. He had plenty of work. He was writing for all these TV shows, hundreds of scripts, but he wanted to do something. He was at a point in his life where he said, what do I really want to do that can be important? And he had a family, he had daughters, and he had a boy on the way. And so he wanted to do something that maybe could save us. And I would make an argument that Star Trek has saved us. I mean, if you really think back to what was going on in the 60s, this show brought so many people together and got so many people to look into the future more than any movie or any book could do, because it had such a giant audience. And so that's what he wanted to do. When he came back to do Next Generation, he took it a step further, which wasn't as good dramatically as a TV show, but philosophically, it was good that he wanted to now show us beyond our petty differences.
Vic, do you run into, I talked to Mark about this earlier, certainly with you doing Star Trek Continues, do you run into a lot of the different Star Trek fans that are out there that are divided, right? Whether it's TOS or the Next Generation, and the infighting that does go on there because they like what they like, right? Do you run into that opposition out there because you go to so many conferences?
I'll be honest with you, I don't. But let me tell you why. I mean, I think that the Star Trek family, if I may use that word, it's like a family reunion. You've got cousins from uncles and brothers and sisters and family that you may not even know, but you're connected. And so while there are certainly each different generation had their Star Trek. For me, it was the original series. For the generation after me, Next Generation was their Star Trek. But there wouldn't be a Next Generation without the original series. And there wouldn't be a Voyager without Next Gen. You know what I mean? And there wouldn't be a Deep Space Nine or an Enterprise, and even now a Discovery. They're all built off of each other. They all come from the same basic universe. And even though they're different, I think the majority of Star Trek fans appreciate the diversity. Spock said it best, right, Mark? Idic. Infinite diversity, infinite combinations. And how all these things still have a common thread. And I feel like Star Trek fans get that. I think they appreciate all of the iterations of Star Trek.
I wish...
I got to tell you, when the first of my books came out in 2013, the second one 14, third one 15, and we're continuing on. But I went to a convention in Vegas, the August 2013 convention, and my publisher Robert Jacobs was there, and he had never been to a convention before. I don't think he knew much about Star Trek. He may call in and correct me, but I believe that's true. But I remember what he said to me in this giant convention where you had like 30,000 people. He turned to me and he said, I have never been in a place with so many positive people from all different walks of life, intelligent, positive people. He was blown away by what he encountered at that convention. He did not expect it, and it really had a major impact on him.
Well, I wish I could have had these arguments with my two nephews a few months ago when we were sitting there talking about this subject. And when I told them that the original series for me is where it's at, and the turn that they took in defense of Next Generation and deep everything that followed. They just laid it out, and I could not get them to get any type of appreciation out of the original series. It was incredible to me. I was fighting. It almost came to fisticuffs.
Wow,
Jimmy, I got to tell you something real quick. When I was writing these books, which was in 2010, 11, 12, 13, my son was still living at home, and he came into my office. He was probably 16 at that time. And the first rebooted Star Trek movie had come out with Chris Pike right around then. And there was a channel in Orange County that was running the original Star Trek every night and then running Next Generation right after it. And he was watching these. Actually, it was the other way around. They'd run Next Generation followed by the original series. And he would watch these, and it would be 11 o'clock, and he'd turn out the light and go to bed after watching an original show. And he came into my office, and he said, "Hey, Dad, I've been watching the show you're writing these books about. It's really pretty good, really good." I said, "Really? You've been watching the original Star Trek?" He says, Yeah. It comes on right after Next Generation. And I turn out the light, and I lie there thinking about what I had just seen and what it was saying to me. And he says, "I like it a lot. I think it's a lot better than the shitty one you wrote for," which was Next Generation. No offense to Next Generation people. I didn't say that. My son said it.
Speaking of that, Vic, do you, with the family, you do so many, let me ask you really quick, how many, what's your next convention?
It's funny you should mention that. I just did my last one of the year. I was at a show in Montgomery, Alabama this past weekend. And, you know, I'd like to just say something along the lines of what Mark said. You know, so many sci-fi fans, Star Trek fans in particular, but sci-fi fans in general, and even pop culture fans, for many, many years always felt kind of marginalized, and they felt like the nerds and the weirdos and the odd man out. And these conventions give them an opportunity to be surrounded by people who love what they love. And for that weekend, they're not the odd man out. They're not the weird sci-fi nerd. They are part of the group. And that's why the spirit, like Mark said, the spirit is so positive, because people just love knowing that they can wear a uniform or paint their skin blue or put on antenna or any number of things and fit right in and be welcomed, surrounded by people who love what they love.
Do your fans ever ask you to get into character? They do, don't they?
They do, yeah, occasionally, but you know, I don't do that any more than Bill Shatner wears a uniform when he goes to a convention.
Right. And
yeah, but you're wearing the uniform, Vic. He comes to the convention dressed as Captain Kirk, and it's a beautiful thing to see. Usually in the wraparound tunic, Vic, which I like so much, the season 2 one.
Right. Well, I mean, I've only done that a couple of times, but I mean, I have been asked to wear a uniform to a convention an awful lot, but I don't want to do that. I feel like it kind of ruins the illusion, if you know what I mean.
Well, I think about Rita and I, and I'm not kidding about this, 2 nights ago we watched Galaxy Quest.
Oh, I love that movie.
I love that movie so much.
Did you see the documentary?
I've seen that documentary 50 times.
I love it.
I love it.
To see it when it came into the theater here.
Oh man! So I love that movie. That movie is a documentary. The documentary is a documentary of the documentary.
Yes.
So the scenes of the convention when these fans are coming up and they want answers on certain episodes, and they're getting into this in a different mindset, right? Where they are not thinking necessarily that the episode is real, but that the character is real. And at that moment, you're sitting on the other side of the table, Vic, at these conferences. And do you get approached in the same way that it's portrayed in that, where they want your philosophy on an episode? And
I absolutely do. And you know what? I nerd out right along with them. I love nothing more than for someone to want to talk about the episodes that we did, and want to know more about how they were made and where the idea came from. Oh my goodness, you guys, just this past weekend in Montgomery, Alabama, there was a man that was another guest, and a signing guest with me, named Philo Barnhart. Do you know that name?
No, I don't, but this is going to be good.
Philo, he's an animator and an artist who worked for Disney. He actually created Ariel from Little Mermaid,
right?
And worked with them. But many years ago, he did a lot of special effects work, and he did special effects for Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And when we were at the show this past weekend, I didn't know him, had no idea who he was. He came up to my autograph table and he said, "Vic, I'm so excited to meet you. I told my manager to try to find a convention that you were going to be at that he could book me into, because I have every one of your episodes on my laptop. I love every one of them." And we went to dinner Sunday night and sat across the table and just talked Star Trek and Star Trek Continues. And he had hundreds of questions about our stories and our characters and our series. And nothing gives me more joy. We didn't make a penny from our series. It was not about making money. It was not about turning a profit. It was about paying tribute and giving love to a show that meant so much to me and so many others. And Philo, to sit there with this gentleman who's, mid-60s, worked on Star Trek: The Motion Picture and is a huge Star Trek fan, to hear him talk with such love about my series was an incredible honor. It was so humbling.
Somebody just tweeted, I don't know if you guys caught this, somebody just tweeted, "It's so cool that Jimmy is a nerd. He's nerding out with Mark and Vic right now, and I'm loving it."
I tell you what, we're all nerds for something, Jimmy. When
I grew up, just like everybody else says the same thing, but I grew up with Star Trek, and I was 5. Mark, I don't know how old you are, but I was 5 when Star Trek came out. So I was 5, 6, 7, 8. I was about as influential as I could be at that age.
I was 10, and let me tell you, it influenced a 10-year-old even more.
Yeah, I can only imagine, right? And to go and see not only the legacy get preserved, Mark, through your books and this audio book, but the Star Trek Continues and what goes into that. For me, I just feel like it was done for me, because it was part of my life.
And it was.
Listen, we were talking about the episode Charlie X a moment ago, because we were talking about Dorothy, and she wrote that from Gene Roddenberry's idea. And I remember the first time I sat across from Dorothy at a lunch and interviewed her, and I told her that when I first saw that episode, Charlie Evans was, 16, 17, and he had a crush on Yeoman Rand. And he goes into Kirk, and he says, "I don't know why I feel like I do. I don't know why my insides are just upside down, and I feel sick all the time." And Kirk says to him, "Charlie, what you're feeling is just nothing that any other guy hasn't felt since the model came out. And I was probably 15 when I saw that episode. I didn't see it when it was first aired on NBC. I saw it when it was repeated a few years later. And when I saw that episode, it was like having a father-son talk with somebody that I'd never had a chance to have, because I'd never talked to my father like that. And I'm sitting there 15 years old feeling sick to my stomach every time a pretty girl would walk by me, or one that I had a crush on at school. And Kirk's telling me, it's okay, you're normal, there's nothing wrong with you. And what other TV show was doing that? I never saw that talk on the Andy Griffith Show or Ironside or anything else. I saw it on Star Trek. And I said to Dorothy, I said, you really helped me. And she said, oh, Gene wrote those lines. And she was kind of bugged by it, because she said, Gene always kind of puts sex into things. And I said, but that helped me, Dorothy. You should feel good that your name was on that. So, it's just a show that really impacted us. And my son coming into my room when he was 16 and saying he would lie awake after watching these shows, it still works. If anybody out there is 16, watch Charlie X. If you're a guy especially, watch Charlie X and see what it does for you.
Vic, I wanted to ask you, speaking of the sets, what happened to the set? Did you move it to L.A.? Do you live in it?
No. I'm excited. I'm so glad you asked. Jimmy. No, the sets are standing alive and well exactly where we built them. A wonderful gentleman named Ray Tessie took over the sets after we finished our series. What are we going to do with them, right? We finished. And Ray is another Star Trek fan of a similar age to us, and he wanted to take them over and make them available for other fans to shoot projects there, and for people to have special events there, and even he has opened up the studio to have open houses and fan appreciation weekends where anyone can go to the studio and walk through the original Enterprise and take pictures, sit in the captain's chair, step up on the transporter platform, go into the sick bay, Jeffrey's tube, engineering, you name it. And I would encourage your listeners to take down this URL, Neutral Zone Studios.
I'm writing it down, Neutral.
Because that is the website. And let me tell you, Jimmy, there is going to be one day in January, one day in February, one day in March, and one day in April where I'm going to the studio and I'm going to be giving people personal tours of the sets, telling them the stories of how they were built, where we got the things we got, how we figured this out, where that came from. And it's free of charge. Neutral Zone Studios. I think it's .com. It may be .org, but it would be easy enough to find on the internet. And all of the dates and times and locations and details for these open houses will be there. And you can not only walk through it for free, but experience, the studio where we shot Star Trek Continues.
I don't know if you know who Steve Neal is.
Yes.
You know Steve? Okay.
I do. Well, I know Steve through Doug Drexler.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So I'm out at Steve's studio here. Mark, you're going to love this. I'm at his studio, and he's one of the great model builders, period, right? He's just one of the best guys. Done tons of film. But I'm out at his studios in Oxnard, and he built the captain's chair, right? And so, and it's just like the Star Trek Continues set, right? It's the real deal. Mm-hmm. And I sat in that thing, and it's all lit up. He's got one of the original communicators, right? He's got a replica. He's got the original, right? I'm holding that in my hand with a Tribble, sitting in that captain's chair, and I never felt more like the king of the world.
Well, I can tell you one setting where you will feel more like the king of the world, and that is our studio. Because you may have sat in the captain's chair in Steve Neal's house, but there is nothing like
walking onto the bridge of the Enterprise.
I can't imagine, man.
And sitting in that chair and spinning around and looking all around you. And there's the helm nav console in front of you, and Scotty stationed to your left, and Spock stationed to the right, and the turbo lift and Uhura behind you. And not just the bridge, Jimmy, but everything. Everything they built, the big bending corridor, sick bay, transporter room, briefing room, captain's quarters, aux control, Jeffrey's tube, engineering, bridge. It's all there. And I would be most honored, Jimmy.
I would love to go check it out.
If you could find a way to get down, fly on down for one of these days and let me give you a tour of our studio.
I would love that so much. Mark, did you ever go out?
You did this pretty much like Stage 9, didn't you, where the original set was? It's kind of laid out the same way?
Oh, yeah, it is laid out. Jimmy, it's laid out exactly. The footprint is exactly the same as the original series.
Didn't you get the original blueprints?
Yes, all of those sets, all of those rooms were connected to the corridor.
Right.
And so once you step into the corridor at the end, once the doors open at the end of the corridor, you're in it. You are in it as if you were on the ship.
You know what I did, Mark? I don't know if you did this, but I would watch Star Trek Continues, and then I would freeze it, and I would go and watch the original series. And I would compare the captain's quarters, right?
Yeah,
and the bridge.
Yeah. Well, Stage 9 at Desilu, which then became Paramount, was for the entire ship. All the sets that Vic has on his stage kind of laid out the same way.
Right.
And when they did Next Generation, Jimmy, they used Stage 9 at Paramount, the very same stage, and built the entire ship on the stage. Stage 10 was built for the planet sets, but Stage 9 was the entire ship. So they used the same stage and pretty much the same layout. So that would be an interesting comparison.
Yeah, it's Stage 9 over on Melrose.
Mm-hmm.
Right? On Melrose, that corner. Right. I'm trying to think the sides.
Yeah, that was Desilu.
Right.
And Paramount was right next door, and there was a wall between them.
Right.
And Star Trek bankrupted. Not Star Trek alone. Star Trek and Mission Impossible combined caused Desilu to go bankrupt because they were too expensive. And so she had to sell to Paramount, and they tore the wall down. And in Season 2 of my 3-book set, there's a picture of Lucille Ball cutting the ribbon where the wall used to be. And she's forcing a smile on her face, but she looks so sad because she's having to give up her studio that she and Desi built. But that's what she gave to Star Trek. She believed in the show. She believed it can rerun as long as I Love Lucy did, and she put everything she had on the line for it.
Vic, are we going to see a Star Trek continues?
I hope so.
Me too.
Well, I will tell you this. Ever since we finished the original series, I've been kicking around, and what would be not more episodes, but maybe like a feature film, maybe a film that reunites us, and somewhere in the timeline between the motion picture and the Wrath of Khan, somewhere in there. I've even got an idea for it. That's really going to be dependent on the fan film guidelines as it stands right now. It's impossible to do something like that under the current setting. But
why
as
is
Mr.
that?
Spock used to say, I'd like to think there are always possibilities.
Yeah, why is it so constrained?
Well, I don't want to bring your show down, but in a nutshell, there was a fan production that raised a buttload of money to make a movie that not only did they never make, but the money was gone, and CBS basically stepped in and said, okay, that's enough, and they filed a lawsuit against the production for raising all this money and not doing what they said they were going to do, and they were very arrogant about it and saying we're going to make a
feature film, and it's going to be better than the Star Trek films, and it's going to be a, whatever, professional, this and that. And CBS, up to that point, had been allowing fan films to exist as long as they didn't cross the line of profiting from Star Trek.
Right.
But this production, the people in charge of this production started paying themselves salaries and buying themselves all kinds of things and flying around the world in first class to promote a movie they hadn't shot one frame of. And it was the last straw. And CBS basically said, okay, that's enough. And one of the things that came out of the lawsuit were these quote unquote fan film guidelines. Basically things like it can't be longer than 15 minutes. You can't use anyone that was a part of official Star Trek. You're not allowed to use like SAG actors. You can't raise more than $50,000. There are a lot of constraints. Star Trek Continues would not be able to go on under those constraints, but we are very grateful to CBS because when they put these guidelines in place, they called me and they said, look, we know that it was your intention to finish the original series. How quickly can you do that? So they could have called and said, you're done. Hang up your tunic, you're done.
Right.
But they didn't. They said, finish it up as quick as you can. And we were able to finish the original series of Star Trek, which had never been done. And I'm extremely grateful for that. But I'd like to think that there may be something down the pike somewhere that we might be able to do.
Thank you
I
both.
think CBS should have put Star Trek Continues on their streaming service that they opened up for Discovery.
Yep.
I think it'd be a great companion show for Discovery. And you watch those episodes as you have, Jimmy. It's got the quality of a network show.
Yep.
It could be up there, and it's got the talent, it's got the writing, it's got the themes, and hopefully maybe somebody's listening, or maybe your listeners can write in and demand this. But I would love to see Vic back in that captain's chair.
That gives me some ideas that we'll talk about off of the air. Thank you both. Vic, how many conferences and conventions are you going to do next year in 2020?
Well, as many as I can. I already have, I don't know, I probably have 8 or 10 lined up so far, and it's still early for the ones later in the year. So I'm hoping to do more. And I want you to know, Jimmy, I've been begging Mark to come down to the studio. With all of the time he has spent, all of his life he has devoted these last 7 and 8 years to Star Trek and writing these books. He needs to come to the studio and walk through those corridors and experience that. And I would love for you to do it as well. I'm extending a personal invitation to both of you in front of all your listeners. They're my witnesses. I want you guys to come down and experience this.
Mark, are you down?
Are you down?
I'm down. I'm down.
Let's discuss that and see if we can set something up.
I think it would be great. Thank you so much for the invite, Vic. And Mark, I know it's markcushman.com is one website. And where can everybody go and get the books?
TheseAreTheVoyages.com.
TheseAreTheVoyages.com, and everybody knows about StarTrekContinues.com. That website there is so much content there.
Yeah.
Everybody just go, start watching, have fun. It's right there. Star Trek Continues. Vic, Mark, enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. It's been a blast.
Vic, I'll be in touch. Mark, I'll be in touch. And like I said, thank you so much, guys, for all of this and making this such a special evening for me.
Absolutely, Jimmy. Listen, go to that Neutral Zone Studios website. I think the first open house is January 18th. And then there's a date in February and date in March. Look at your schedule and hop on a plane and pop down there and let me share this with you. You'll feel like you're 10 years old again, Jimmy. I'm telling you. It's like a dream. It's like stepping into a dream. Nothing will ever compare to it.
Thank you so much
now
for
for
that.
Jimmy, that's going to be 5 years old.
I know, right?
That's right.
Rita, my wife right now, is probably on Amazon getting me a Captain Kirk costume right now.
Get robe if they're available.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Take care. Thanks, Jimmy.
That will be a wrap. We went poll to poll here, and I'm right up against it. I skipped through the network break. I did all of this for you, the Fadernauts. Fade to Black's executive producers, Rita Camurian. Show is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee, Dennis, and Bob. Announcers are Steve Harder, Gene Vito, and Mark D. Kovar. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intro, Spaceboy, spaceboymusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network, and syndication is KGRA, The Planet. This broadcast owned and copyrighted 2019 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black or the Game Changer Network. I got to thank Marc Cushman and Vic Mignongna. Great conversation tonight. Tomorrow night is our 6th anniversary special event, Fader Night, open lines with all of you all night long. Until then, I'm your host, Jimmy Church. I want everybody to be safe. Go back, Lee Tappy.